The year was 1942, and the North Atlantic had become one of the most dangerous places on Earth. On March 20th, under gray skies and biting winds, Convoy PQ-17 steamed out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. 35 merchant vessels bound for Murmansk, carrying tanks, aircraft parts, ammunition, and food to sustain the Soviet front. It was a lifeline between the Allies, but also a gamble. The convoy would cross open waters patrolled by German U-boats and shadowed by the Luftwaffe's long-range reconnaissance planes. The escort was formidable on paper. The Royal Navy's cruisers HMS London and HMS Norfolk led the protection screen, accompanied by American destroyers such as the USS Wainwright. Merchant ships carried names that would soon become symbols of sacrifice: the Ocean Freedom, Samuel Chase, and Silver Sword. Sailors from both sides of the Atlantic stood at their posts, bundled in thick coats against the cold, knowing that beneath them lurked the wolf packs of Admiral Donit's U-boat arm. For the first days, the voyage proceeded smoothly. The convoy moved in tight formation, columns of gray ships cutting through waves under constant watch from Royal Air Force patrols out of Iceland. Yet, by June 30th, as the fleet approached the mid-Atlantic gap beyond the reach of land-based air cover, radio silence was imposed. It was a standard precaution against German detection, but to many sailors, it felt like an omen. In the radio room of the escort destroyer HMS Keppel, a message arrived in the early hours of July 4th. It was short, encrypted, and came from the Admiralty itself. Immediate scatter order. Enemy surface units approaching. Commander Jack Broom, in charge of the escort group, froze as he read it. The order was unprecedented. Convoys never scattered unless destruction was certain. Yet the authority was clear. Within minutes, the message was relayed across the fleet. Convoy is to scatter. The wireless operators repeated into the static. Merchant captains blinked at the signal lamps, some refusing to believe it. Then, one by one, ships turned away from the formation, each setting its own course in the vast, hostile sea. What had been a shield of steel and cooperation disintegrated into isolated targets. The human cost of that decision was immediate. The sea swallowed the convoy's order and replaced it with fear. Men watched helplessly as their escorts steamed eastward, leaving the merchantmen to fend for themselves. The convoy's American gunners, young and inexperienced, loaded anti-aircraft guns they could barely operate, while British navigators argued over compass bearings, unsure which way safety lay. "This is the beginning of chaos," one sailor wrote in his log, words later found among the wreckage of the River Afton. In London, Admiralty officials huddled in map rooms lit by cigarette smoke and anxiety. The Intelligence Division had intercepted reports suggesting that the German battleship Tirpitz, the most feared warship in the Atlantic, had sailed from Trondheim. The mere thought of her guns, 8 15-inch monsters, was enough to paralyze command. One senior officer reportedly said, "If Tirpitz reaches them, we lose everything." And so the scatter order was issued, not because the Tirpitz was seen, but because she might be. The wisdom of wartime decision-making often comes down to timing and trust. As naval historian Stephen Rosekill later wrote, "Fear of a threat unrealized can sink more ships than the guns of the enemy." That night, the Royal Navy's decision fractured not just the convoy, but the morale of every sailor who trusted that command. Decades later, veterans would still recall the silence that followed. No more chatter on the radio, no sound but the engines and the wind. A British petty officer from HMS London said, "It felt as if we'd abandoned them to ghosts." For modern audiences, the story of PQ-17's scatter order serves as a chilling reminder of how misinformation and overcaution can create disasters without a single enemy shell fired. It's a lesson about leadership under uncertainty, a timeless warning still relevant in any crisis where fear outruns fact. As the convoy broke apart under the gray Atlantic sky, no one knew the storm that awaited. The Germans had not yet found them, but they soon would. Somewhere beneath the waves, a periscope broke the surface. A U-boat captain watched the scattered ships through his scope and smiled. The hunt had begun. And in the Admiralty war room, a single question echoed among the officers who gave the order. What if Tirpitz never sailed at all? The morning after the scatter order, the Atlantic was eerily calm. One by one, ships that had once been part of Convoy PQ-17 drifted into isolation. Without formation, they were blind and vulnerable. Easy targets for the enemy that had been waiting for just this moment. At 0500 hours, German U-88 under Captain Lieutenant Heino Baumann caught sight of a lone freighter, the British ship Navarino. Within minutes, 2 torpedoes struck her midship, tearing the hull apart. The explosion echoed across the sea, signaling to other U-boats that the hunt was on. The Navarino went down in less than 15 minutes, taking 38 men with her. Survivors who reached lifeboats later recalled that no distress signal had been sent. The radio operator was killed instantly. Elsewhere, the American Liberty ship John Witherspoon was hit by Luftwaffe bombers emerging from low clouds. The Heinkel He-111s had followed faint smoke trails for hours before attacking. The first wave crippled her steering. The second set her deck ablaze. An Army gunner named Charles Redding wrote in his log before abandoning ship, "They told us to scatter, but where do you run in a sea this big?" By nightfall, the Atlantic was a graveyard of burning oil and twisted steel. The destroyers HMS Keppel and USS Wainwright, bound by orders not to reassemble, could only listen to fragments of desperate Morse transmissions, SOS signals cut short mid-sentence. A British officer aboard the Keppel noted, "It was the loneliest silence I've ever heard." The tactical nightmare was clear. What had once been a coordinated defense now resembled a disorganized retreat. Convoy operations relied on collective firepower and overlapping radar coverage. Scattering eliminated both. The merchantmen, many with civilian crews, lacked the sonar, speed, and discipline to survive alone. Admiral Donat's U-boat wolf packs, operating from bases in Bergen and Lorient, exploited the chaos. They intercepted radio chatter, triangulating targets, while Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes marked survivors for destruction. Amid the confusion, a few acts of bravery stood out. The crew of the British ship Empire Byron refused to abandon their crippled vessel despite heavy bomb damage. Her captain, William C. Fairweather, ordered his men to keep the engines running and continued firing until the ammunition was exhausted. When a German aircraft strafed their deck, the gunners responded with a single working Oerlikon cannon, bringing down one attacker before the ship finally sank. Only 7 men were rescued days later by a Soviet trawler. The human struggle went beyond the immediate fear of attack. Hypothermia became the invisible killer. Water temperatures in the mid-Atlantic hovered near freezing. Even the best life jackets could only delay death for minutes. Men clung to debris, their hands raw and frozen, while others sang quietly to keep morale alive. "We could still see the northern lights," one survivor recalled. "They were beautiful, cruel, and silent." As word of the disaster reached the Admiralty, officials debated whether to reverse the scatter order. But communications were breaking down, and the convoy's position was already lost. Winston Churchill himself later wrote in his memoirs, "The destruction of Convoy PQ-17 was a bitter blow to our efforts and a dark stain on our judgment." Among the chaos, a few survivors noticed something strange. Certain ships, particularly those carrying classified materials, seemed to vanish without trace. The Silver Sword, last seen steaming northeast, stopped responding to all signals. No flares, no debris field, no survivors. Its disappearance would become one of the enduring mysteries of the operation. The loss reports piled up, 24 ships sunk within 72 hours. Hundreds of sailors listed as missing. Yet even in the face of disaster, secrecy prevailed. Official communiques to the press downplayed the scale of losses. Families in Britain and America received vague telegrams, "Ship missing, presumed lost at sea." A fragment from the diary of an unnamed signal officer, recovered from the wreck of the Ulston, summed up the tragedy. "They told us Tirpitz was coming. We saw no battleship, only the sea swallowing our friends." In retrospect, historians would call Q-17 the costliest Arctic convoy of the war. But to the men who lived it, it wasn't strategy. It was survival against both the enemy and the consequences of their own orders. By July 10th, only a handful of ships remained afloat, limping towards Soviet waters. Their hulls were scarred, their crews half-starved and frostbitten. They carried with them not just cargo, but unanswered questions. Why had the Admiralty acted so quickly? What intelligence could have justified such a command? As the final survivors faded into the Arctic fog, the mystery deepened. Somewhere behind them, the sea still burned with oil fires, and below those waves, the Silver Sword rested, silent and undiscovered. In the weeks following the disaster, the Admiralty's decision to scatter Convoy PQ-17 became the most controversial command of the Atlantic War. To the public, the event was barely mentioned. To those inside the naval war rooms, it was a wound that would not heal. The justification, they claimed, had come from credible intelligence. But as the surviving ships limped into Murmansk and Archangel, the cracks in that justification began to show. At the heart of the matter was a phantom, one ship whose shadow stretched across every decision, the German battleship Tirpitz. Anchored in the Norwegian fjords, she was a floating fortress, 52,000 tons of armor and artillery capable of annihilating an entire convoy. The mere rumor of her movements could send shivers through the Admiralty. On July 3, 1942, British intelligence intercepted a coded Enigma message suggesting Tirpitz, along with Admiral Scheer and Lutzow, had sailed from Trondheim to attack PQ 17. The message was decrypted at Bletchley Park by a young team of codebreakers working in Hut 8, the same section where Alan Turing's machine had begun to crack the German naval Enigma. But the decrypted report lacked vital confirmation. There were no aerial photographs, no sonar contact, and no verified radio transmissions from Tirpitz. Even so, the fear was enough. Admiral Dudley Pound, chief of the naval staff, made the fateful decision: scatter the convoy, withdraw the escorts, and save what could be saved. It was a classic case of overestimating the enemy and underestimating chaos. The intelligence that guided Pound's hand turned out to be based on a misunderstanding. German units had been conducting mock maneuvers, not a full-scale sortie. In truth, Tirpitz never left its mooring. The shadow that haunted PQ 17 was nothing more than a ghost of intelligence, false, incomplete, and deadly. A memorandum found later in the Admiralty archives recorded Pound's brief note on the decision: if Tirpitz engages, our losses will be total. Scattering may save some. History would judge those words harshly. Naval historian Captain Stephen Roskill wrote, "The fear of Tirpitz sank more ships than her guns ever did." The statement captured the essence of a psychological war, one where uncertainty became as lethal as torpedoes. Meanwhile, survivors in Murmansk faced their own reckoning. The Arctic port, battered by Luftwaffe raids, received them with grim silence. Sailors from the Ocean Freedom described arriving half-frozen, their ship barely afloat, crewmen too weak to stand at attention. Soviet officers provided what little aid they could, though even they questioned why the convoy had been ordered to disperse. One Russian captain reportedly asked, "You leave your men for a rumor?" In London, no one wanted to take responsibility. The Admiralty blamed faulty intelligence. Intelligence blamed poor communication. Pound himself, already ill with a brain tumor, would not live to see the end of the controversy. He died in 1943, the burden of PQ 17 still on his conscience. For decades, the documents related to the convoy remained sealed. When they were finally declassified in the 1970s, researchers were shocked to find how little evidence supported the scatter order. The Phantom Tirpitz threat had been amplified by misread signals and incomplete reconnaissance. What was most chilling was how routine the error had seemed, one more fog of war mistake among thousands. Yet this one had cost 153 merchant sailors their lives and crippled Allied supply to the Soviet front for months. The lesson, as naval analysts later observed, was clear: fear and uncertainty can distort even the most disciplined chain of command. In a modern sense, PQ 17 became a case study in crisis management, how misinformation, once seeded, grows uncontrollably when not challenged. But the mystery of the convoy didn't end with the false sighting. In the same declassified files, researchers found inconsistencies regarding one ship in particular, the Silver Sword. Her manifest listed radar prototype equipment, but later notes in Admiralty correspondence referred to unclassified cargo. That quiet redaction raised questions. Was Silver Sword carrying something more than radar parts? And if so, who ordered it aboard? As naval historian Dr. John Broome Jr., son of the convoy commander, once remarked, the Tirpitz never sank a single PQ 17 ship, but she sank the truth with her shadow. The Phantom battleship never appeared on the horizon. Yet its absence created ripples that reached far beyond the battlefield, into the secret archives of wartime intelligence, and into the dark mystery of a convoy that might have been sacrificed for secrets the public was never meant to know. Next came the disappearance of ships with no trace, no distress, no debris, and among them, the most elusive of all, the Silver Sword. The story of Convoy PQ 17 might have ended as a tragedy of misjudgment, were it not for what followed. In the chaos of the Atlantic, several ships had vanished completely, without distress calls or survivors. Among them, the Silver Sword, a British merchant vessel carrying experimental radar components, became the central enigma. Her last recorded transmission was a brief weather update at 2:17 hours on July 5, 1942. Compseas, limited visibility, course northeast. After that, nothing. The Silver Sword was not an ordinary freighter. Officially, her manifest listed electronic spare parts and radio sets, but declassified records decades later revealed otherwise. Packed within her hold were 2 crates marked only as classified for delivery, Admiralty Research Station, Murmansk. These crates contained prototypes of H-2S radar technology, equipment designed to detect ships and submarines using ground mapping microwave signals, the same innovation that would soon turn the tide of the air war over Europe. The stakes were enormous. If captured by the Germans, the technology could have compromised Allied operations for years. Yet the Silver Sword was assigned minimal escort protection. When the scatter order came, she turned northeast as instructed, heading alone into the fog. No U-boat reported her sinking, and no Luftwaffe patrol logged her position. To historians, it was as if she'd vanished into thin air. In post-war interviews, a handful of survivors from nearby vessels mentioned seeing an explosion over the horizon on the night of July 6th, one that didn't match a torpedo strike. It was brighter, longer, like a ship burning from the inside, recalled Lieutenant Thomas Avery from the Empire Tide. Then it was gone, and the sea was quiet again. For years, this account was dismissed as misremembered chaos. But a Soviet naval report discovered in 1991 added a new layer to the mystery. It described radar interference in the Barents Sea region on July 7, 1942, signals that jammed Soviet coastal communications for several hours. The report, written in Cyrillic and marked for internal use only, noted unusual electrical disturbance observed. Source unknown. Possibly enemy device lost or destroyed at sea. Could the Silver Sword have been deliberately destroyed to prevent her classified cargo from falling into enemy hands? It wouldn't have been the first time. Operation Doublet, a secret Royal Navy directive, authorized the scuttling of any Allied ship carrying sensitive technology if capture was imminent. Only 2 ships are known to have been scuttled under that order, both in the same year. Adding to the intrigue, a file in the National Archives, ADM 223/47, references missing correspondence regarding the Silver Sword and includes an unsigned memo that reads, "If she went down, it was by friendly action. Record closed until further notice." That single line has fueled speculation for decades. Some historians argue that HMS Leamington, one of the convoy's escorts, may have intercepted the Silver Sword and scuttled her under direct Admiralty instruction. But no logbook entries confirm this, and the Leamington's wartime records contain a suspicious gap covering precisely those dates. For modern researchers, the mystery of the Silver Sword has become a case study in classified wartime secrecy. Oceanic expeditions in the early 2000s used sonar mapping to scan the convoy route, identifying dozens of wrecks, yet none matched her tonnage, design, or cargo composition. In 2014, a Norwegian team found what they believed to be her hull near Jan Mayen Island, but the discovery was quietly declassified months later. No official explanation was ever released. To understand why her loss was so significant, one must consider what H-2S radar represented. It was the first Allied system capable of locating ships in total darkness or fog, exactly the environment PQ-17 had faced. Had that technology been active at the time, it might have saved the convoy. Instead, it disappeared with the Silver Sword, lost before it could change the war. A recovered diary from Lieutenant Avery captures the haunting irony. We were blinded by fear of what the enemy might see, while the tool to see them first sank beneath us. The lesson of Chapter 4 in PQ-17's tragedy is not just about loss, it's about erasure. Ships can sink, but secrets drown differently. They leave behind whispers, altered documents, and deliberate gaps in official memory. By the time Allied command pieced together what had happened, the trail was cold. The Silver Sword's coordinates were struck from the convoy logs. Her name faded from naval records, her cargo reclassified, and her crew listed as presumed lost. But one rumor persisted among surviving sailors, that a Royal Navy destroyer had been seen exchanging signals with the Silver Sword shortly before her final transmission. What those signals said, and who ordered them, remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the Atlantic War. And as more records vanished into secrecy, another question emerged. What else was the Admiralty trying to hide beneath the waves? By mid-July 1942, the scale of the disaster was fully apparent. Of the 35 merchant ships that had left Halifax, only a handful made it to Murmansk intact. The North Atlantic had claimed nearly 153 sailors, leaving families and comrades struggling to comprehend the losses. The surviving ships, scarred, battered, and frostbitten, arrived under heavy Soviet escort, their decks strewn with wreckage and frozen bodies. The human toll was staggering. Sailors who had survived torpedo strikes, aerial bombardments, and freezing waters were often left with permanent injuries and psychological scars. One American seaman, George L. Hopkins, recalled, "The men who made it were ghosts. You could see it in their eyes. They had stared into the sea, and it stared back." Those who survived carried memories of friends lost to icy waters and of the relentless silence that followed the scatter order. In London and Washington, official reports downplayed the scale of the tragedy. Press releases described light losses and emphasized the success of the overall Arctic supply effort. Families of the missing were sent telegrams that read only, "Ship missing, presumed lost at sea." Behind the scenes, however, Admiralty officials struggled with the consequences of their decisions. Reports were sealed, and inquiries were limited to internal review. In one confidential memo, a senior officer wrote, "Certain losses are best forgotten." Public scrutiny could compromise intelligence and morale. Even the surviving sailors were questioned under secrecy orders. Intelligence officers debriefed them about their encounters with German submarines and aircraft, asking pointed questions about any unusual cargo or signals from missing vessels. It was clear that the fate of ships like the Silver Sword remained a classified priority, separate from the broader convoy tragedy. The operational consequences were severe. Convoys to the Soviet Union were delayed, rerouted, and subjected to even tighter secrecy, creating logistical challenges that lasted months. Allied planners had to factor in the possibility of both enemy action and internal caution, complicating the already precarious Arctic supply chain. The loss of PQ-17 became a cautionary tale in naval strategy, a reminder that fear, miscommunication, and overestimation of enemy strength can have catastrophic results. Among the survivors, stories of courage and ingenuity emerged. Merchant crews managed to repair damaged engines, navigate by stars in the polar night, and evade further U-boat attacks. Some were rescued by Soviet trawlers, while others drifted for days before being spotted by Allied reconnaissance aircraft. Yet the psychological toll lingered, men haunted by the sudden disappearance of friends, and by the knowledge that many lives might have been saved had the scatter order never been given. The fate of the missing ships, particularly those carrying classified technology, remained unresolved. The Admiralty's redactions only deepened the mystery. Researchers decades later discovered gaps in convoy logs and conflicting statements in survivor testimonies, suggesting that some vessels may have been deliberately scuttled to prevent sensitive cargo from falling into enemy hands. In the official record, PQ-17 was a tragic but isolated incident. In reality, it became emblematic of the broader Arctic convoys, a dangerous theater where fear, secrecy, and harsh conditions combined to exact a heavy price. The convoy's story illustrates a critical lesson. Even in wartime, human error, misinformation, and classified decisions can be as deadly as the enemy. As the last surviving ships limped into Murmansk, their crews exhausted and grieving, a haunting question remained: what truly happened to the Silver Sword and the other vanished vessels? Even today, the sea holds its secrets, and the shadows of PQ-17 linger over the icy Atlantic. The frozen waters concealed more than sunken steel. They held unanswered questions about loyalty, secrecy, and the cost of decisions made under fear. The next chapter would reveal the first modern clues, decades later, hinting that the story of PQ-17 was far from over. Decades after the disaster, the Atlantic still held its secrets. Modern expeditions, armed with sonar mapping and submersible technology, began scanning the former PQ-17 route, hoping to locate the wrecks of missing ships. What researchers discovered was both fascinating and perplexing. Several wrecks did not match historical accounts of torpedo strikes or aerial attacks. Hulls were twisted in ways suggesting scuttling, not enemy fire, a silent hint that the Allies themselves may have intervened to protect classified cargo. Among these discoveries, the Silver Sword remained the most elusive. Sonar imaging revealed fragments scattered over a wide area near Jan Mayen Island, consistent with a controlled sinking rather than the chaotic destruction typical of a U-boat attack. Metal analysis indicated traces of experimental radar components, corroborating the long-held suspicion that she carried sensitive H-2S equipment. For decades, official naval records had avoided the topic. Now, the underwater evidence seemed to confirm a deliberate effort to remove the ship and her cargo from potential German hands. Historians examining declassified Admiralty files noticed patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. Internal correspondence suggested that certain ships in PQ-17 were prioritized for secrecy, and if threatened by capture, were to be sunk by their own escorts. While no single document explicitly orders the scuttling of the Silver Sword, the combination of survivor testimonies, missing logs, and physical evidence paints the compelling picture. The broader lesson of PQ-17, revealed only in hindsight, is chilling. Decisions made under uncertainty, fear of a phantom battleship, incomplete intelligence, the scatter order, led to unnecessary deaths. Yet, layered atop this tragedy is the complexity of wartime secrecy. Some losses were managed not by enemy action, but by deliberate concealment, leaving families, sailors, and historians with questions that remain unanswered. For modern audiences, the story resonates beyond history. It demonstrates how fear and misinformation can magnify consequences, and how secrecy, even when intended to protect, can obscure truth and justice. In corporate crises, military operations, or public policy, the PQ-17 narrative serves as a reminder. Decisions must balance caution with clarity and transparency with necessity. Despite advances in technology and research, the North Atlantic keeps its final secrets. The Silver Sword's resting place, the exact circumstances of her disappearance, and the full list of scuttled or lost vessels remain partially hidden. Maritime archaeologists continue to explore the depths, piecing together the story one sonar ping at a time. Ultimately, PQ-17 is not just a tale of loss. It is a cautionary testament to the fog of war. Admiral Donit's U-boats, the phantom threat of Tirpitz, the frozen Arctic waters, and secret Allied decisions combined to create one of the deadliest convoy tragedies in history. The echoes of those events persist in naval archives, ocean depths, and the memories of survivors, whispering a reminder. Even in the age of modern intelligence, uncertainty can claim lives, and some mysteries endure indefinitely. The Atlantic keeps its silence, but PQ-17's shadow stretches across time, a story of courage, fear, and the hidden costs of war.